Hi, this is Rachel with Beadaholique, and in this video I want to show you how to finish herringbone stitch with a brick stitch decrease. So there are many ways to finish off a herringbone stitch piece of jewelry, and if you've never done herringbone before, you can watch our other videos on how to do this stitch. Another way to finish that I often do is to use a multi-strand tube clasp. So in this piece, I just sewed up from the columns of herringbone and through each loop of the tube clasp, and I finished the bracelet that way. And that's a nice way to finish the bracelet, but I want to show you another way today, and that involves using brick stitch to create a decrease on the end of your herringbone piece to taper the end so you can attach a clasp that has one loop. So it's a pretty versatile way to finish herringbone, and I'll just show you. So it clasps like this, and it adds a pretty nice design element to your herringbone piece. So here's a swatch of flat herringbone stitch. It's 10 beads across with 5 herringbone columns. And since I just finished the last row, my thread is coming out of the last bead on this row. And we're just going to pretend this is a bracelet so I can show you how to finish it. So the first thing you're going to do is sew up and down through the beads of this last row to secure it. And you're going to do that by mimicking ladder stitch. So the first row of your herringbone piece, you start with ladder stitch, and it's a very secure stitch, so we're just going to do the same thing on the other end to get the end of your bracelet nice and secure. And so we're just going to sew down through the next bead, up through the first bead, down through the second bead again, and then up through the adjacent bead, down through the previous bead. It's really just like ladder stitch, and we have another video showing you exactly how to do ladder stitch if you want to watch that. But you can just follow along, and I'm basically showing you how to do ladder stitch without adding new beads. And it involves going up and down through the beads one after another to secure them. And what you're doing is adding thread bridges where there weren't any before in this last row. And it's just tightening up the end row of your herringbone stitch. So just keep working down this last row of your piece, making ladder stitch loops, and adding thread bridges underneath this last row of herringbone. So as you can see, it's really tightening up your last row here, so it looks more like your foundation row. And it's a really strong way to finish off your portion of herringbone stitching. So at the end of this portion, your thread's going to be coming down through the last bead in that row. And you want it to be coming up through that bead to start the brick stitch portion of this technique. So what you're going to do is sew down through the end bead in the lower row, in the previous row, and then up through the adjacent bead, and then up through the last bead in the top row. And your thread will just disappear between those beads. Okay, so now we're going to flip our piece over, and your thread is coming out of the first bead in this top row. So now we're going to start the brick stitch portion of this technique. So pick up 2 beads, and you can use any color you like. You can work it into the pattern of your herringbone piece, or you can use a finishing color. It's really up to you and your design sense. So pick up 2 beads, and we're going to catch the second thread bridge in. So we're going to skip that first thread bridge because that would start the next row with a brick stitch increase, and we're going to sew through the second thread bridge because we want to decrease the piece. So now sew back up through your last bead, catch that thread bridge, and to tighten it we're going to go back down through the first bead and back up through the second bead. And that just tightened it up. And as you can see, we're starting to decrease the piece. We also have another video specifically on how to make increases and decreases in brick stitch, so you can go ahead and watch that for even more clarity. But so this is the beginning of the row, and we're just going to keep sewing brick stitch across this row. So pick up another bead, catch the adjacent thread bridge, and sew back up through that bead, and just keep going along the row. Pick up another bead, catch the next thread bridge, and back up through that bead. So this herringbone piece is 10 beads across, and in our first brick stitch row here we're going to sew 9 beads. So we're basically going to decrease each row by 1 bead at a time. And this will work, of course, with a herringbone piece of any width. You'll just decrease it 1 bead at a time as you taper the end with brick stitch. All right, last bead in this row. Catch the thread bridge, and stitch it down. All right, so this is our row of 9 beads. So the next thing we're going to do is make a row of 8 beads. So to start the row, again, we're going to pick up 2 beads, sew through not the first thread bridge, but the second thread bridge in your first brick stitch row. And then back up through your second bead, back down through the first one, up through the second one, and pull it tight to secure it. And now you're going to keep doing brick stitch down this row, 1 bead at a time on all your subsequent thread bridges. And this will be a row of 8. So just keep working brick stitch down the line until you have 8 beads stitched in place. Last bead. Okay, and now again, I'm going to flip the piece over and start our third brick stitch row. Pick up 2 beads, sew under the second thread bridge, anchor those 2 beads in place, and continue stitching brick stitch all the way down this row. And as you can guess, since we've been decreasing 1 bead per row, this will be a row of 7 beads. And I'm using Miyuki Delica's size 10-0. Pretty big beads. All right, third row done, flip the piece over. And now we're going to do a row of 6. Catch the second thread bridge, anchor the first 2 beads. Oh, careful not to get your thread caught. And keep going with your brick stitch. All right, and now we're going to do one more row. Our row of 3 is going to be the last one. So pick up your 2 anchoring beads, sew through the second thread bridge, which happens to be the middle of your prior row. Do your anchoring stitch. And then just add 1 more bead in this row. And the reason I'm going to stop at a row of 3 is because it has a nice middle point for you to add your clasp. So we just finished a row of 3, thread is coming out of the last bead in the row. I'm going to sew into the middle bead of the row, down through my beadwork, because I actually want to have my needle exit that middle bead in that top row of 3. So we're just going to kind of shimmy the thread around through the beadwork, down through the bead below, up through the adjacent bead, and out through the middle bead in the top row. And pull tight so your thread disappears. And at this point, we're going to add our clasp. So this is just a magnetic clasp. I'm going to separate the halves and string the first half of the clasp. And I'm just going to sew back through that middle bead and through the bead in the previous row below it to anchor it. Pull it tight and that clasp is attached. I'm going to reinforce it actually. 2 thread passes is better than 1, I think. So I'm going to go back up through that adjacent bead in the previous row, back out through the middle bead in the top row, through the loop of the clasp again, back down through the middle bead, and at this point, since the clasp is all reinforced, I'm going to weave in my thread tail. So I'm just going to sew back down through these rows of brick stitch and maybe do a couple of curlicues with my thread just to secure it a little bit more. Keep sewing back down. And when you think your thread is secure enough, I'll go down one more row. When you think your thread is secure enough, just go ahead and take your thread snips and cut it off. All right, so this is a pretty secure join. That is how to attach a clasp to the end of your herringbone piece. Now on the first end of the piece, your ladder stitch row is already done because that was your foundation for the herringbone. So you can skip the step where we mimic the ladder stitch, going around through the beads, and just come out that first bead in your foundation row and start your brick stitch tapering to add the second part of your clasp. And that is how to finish herringbone stitch with a brick stitch decrease. You can find all of these supplies at Beadaholique.com. Thanks so much for watching.